White Fragility is an exhausting, dull, racially obsessed book that only serves to deepen divisions. Robin DiAngelo's bestseller just proves that the woke intersectional left is equally unhealthily obsessed with race as the alt-right white nationalists they claim to despise. White Fragility, Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism, has recently ensconced itself in the global agenda. Despite being written in 2018, its popularity has soared this year in the wake of the killing of George Floyd and global Black Lives Matter protests cum riots. It is currently on both the New York Times and Amazon bestseller lists, no doubt making its author, Robin DiAngelo, a very wealthy woman. I didn't want to read this book, Scandinavian detective novels are more my bag to be honest, but given the prominence of it, I thought it best to see what all the fuss was about. Thus I subjected myself to this exhausting, boring read, so you don't have to put yourself through it or further line the pockets of Professor DiAngelo. The book's argument is simple. If you are white, you are a racist. There is no way out of this fact as DiAngelo says that white people denying they are racist is simply further proof that they are racist. This, she argues, is the eponymous white fragility, which is a product of white people growing up in a society which is steeped in white supremacy. You may well have thought that white supremacy was confined to meetings of skinheads with swastika tattoos and rallies full of hooded lunatics setting fire to crosses. However, DiAngelo argues that Western society is built on white supremacy and as a result it pervades everything. Again, denying that our society is inherently racist only serves to compound and protect that white supremacy on which it is built. Even if people of color gain positions of power in society, such as Barack Obama, Colin Powell, or Clarence Thomas, this does nothing to make the system less racist as they support the status quo. DiAngelo's claims are completely unfalsifiable and effectively make racism in the West something akin to the Force in Star Wars. Perplexingly, along with being unfalsifiable, they are also contradictory. For example, DiAngelo argues that white people don't see themselves in racial terms, while simultaneously arguing that their actions preserve white solidarity. How can a group that doesn't see themselves as a group express solidarity? It is also argued that white people should both not avoid talking about race and not expect black people to educate them about it. This again makes no sense. However, while white people can never not be racist, DiAngelo herself says she is still racist, they can do work to make themselves more aware. Coincidentally, this work happens to be DiAngelo, who along with being a professor in multicultural education specializing in whiteness studies, is also a diversity facilitator. This means that for a fee of between $30,000 and $40,000 she will lecture you for around 90 minutes, at the end of which, if you listen very closely, you will still be racist, but more aware of it. That doesn't exactly seem like money well spent. The purpose of these lectures is not only to make whites aware that they are inherently racist, but also to build up their racial stamina. You see, racial stamina is the way to combat white fragility and, from the sounds of it, building up this stamina is a deeply unpleasant process. The book is littered with anecdotes from these lectures and seminars, all of which appear to end with someone either in tears or storming out in a rage. Although this is obviously no indication of the lectures themselves being bad or insulting, just indicative of white fragility. The crying is a particular problem for Professor DiAngelo, particularly white women crying in front of black people. Indeed, she considers this so much of a problem that there is an entire chapter of the book titled White Women's Tears. Her reasoning behind this is that there is a history of black men being tortured and murdered because of white women's distress. As a white woman herself, she writes, our tears triggered the terrorism of this history, before citing the case of Emmett Till, a 14-year-old boy who was lynched in Mississippi in 1955 after allegedly flirting with a white woman. This example is a perfect illustration of how DiAngelo's warped view of the world manages to simultaneously be insulting to both white and black people. She argues not only that black men will immediately think of lynching when they see a white woman cry, but also that if they comfort the woman they are doing so not out of sympathy or concern, but because they have been conditioned by sexism and the patriarchy. Her argument constantly seems to rob people of color of their own agency, while impugning the motive of racism into any action by a white person. If a white person is nice to a black person, it is racist. If they are nasty to a black person, that is also racist. Saying that you were taught to treat everyone equally is not only racist, but also ignorant as it shows you are unaware of your socialized racism. To illustrate this socialized racism, the book is peppered with anecdotes designed to show that all white people are racist, but really just display DiAngelo's own prejudices. She argues that white people come away from the story of Jackie Robinson believing he was the first black baseball player good enough to play with whites rather than the first who was allowed to. But no one with even a passing interest in the sport believes that he was simply the first black man capable of competing with whites, making her argument a total fallacy. Elsewhere she says that white people use coded language such as sketchy, urban, or bad neighborhood when what they really mean is a lot of black people live there. To demonstrate this, D'Angelo writes about a conversation she was having with a white friend who was telling her about a white couple she knew that had moved to New Orleans for $25,000. Her friend then told her that the couple had also bought a gun, at which point D'Angelo says, "I immediately knew they had bought a home in a black neighborhood." D'Angelo will presumably assert that all white people would make that assumption, but she cannot be sure of that. This statement is indicative of her own prejudices, not a universal one. D'Angelo's argument is a perfect circular one: you are racist because you are white, only white people can be racist, so being racist makes you white. It is then impossible to argue against because denial is simply further proof of your racism. You can't even argue that you just treat people as individuals because that ignores their experience as a member of a group in an inescapable intersectional power structure. Ironically, she shares the exact same view of race as the white nationalist she presumably despises. The best example of the unfalsifiability of her argument comes when D'Angelo lists a series of phrases used by white people to claim they are not racist. This includes phrases like, "I know people of color, I marched in the 60s, the real oppression is class, you don't know me, but the most telling one of all is, I disagree." In Robin D'Angelo's view, disagreeing with her is just proof that you are a racist. There is no room for nuance or debate, no shades of gray. To Professor D'Angelo, the world is, in every sense of the phrase, black and white. Lest we forget, according to a US government-run museum in Washington, nuclear family, rational thinking and planning for the future are just some of the white things whose very existence offends people of color. It only gets worse from there. Whiteness, and its accepted normality, also exist as everyday microaggressions toward people of color, is not a message one might expect to find on the website of a Smithsonian Institution museum. Yet there it is, part of the topic titled Whiteness in a series called Talking About Race, second from the top of the homepage of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. There is no way to tell how long it has been up on the site, but it was brought to the public eye on Tuesday by Claremont Institute President Ryan P. Williams, who described it as divisive propaganda. Others weren't so restrained. "This is seriously the most racist document I've ever seen in mainstream circulation," said columnist Inez Stepman, while radio show host Seth Leibson described it as out-and-out bigotry and called to defund the Smithsonian now. You see, the National Museum is the newest addition to the Smithsonian family of museums opened in 2016 to great fanfare, with then-President Barack Obama in attendance and therefore funded by US taxpayers. The most controversial portion of the whiteness presentation is an infographic about common characteristics of most US white people, based on a slide by corporate consultant Judith H. Katz and spruced up by the National Museum designers. There we find out that self-reliance, nuclear family, the scientific method, Judeo-Christian tradition, delaying gratification, competitiveness and justice based on protecting property and English common law are all white things. What's particularly disturbing is that Katz wrote that back in 1990. According to her bio on the website of Khalil Jamieson Consulting, a New York-based outfit, she actually wrote a handbook for anti-racism training in 1978. Now her ideas have been dusted off and sandwiched between white fragility author and corporate grifter Robin D'Angelo and radical feminist and social justice activist Bell Hooks. Capping off the whiteness section are suggested readings and videos from liberal media outlets such as The Guardian, Vox and The Atlantic, along with questions designed for teachers. And then it hits you. It's a lesson plan. Sure enough, the first of the three categories the museum pitches its Talking About Race series to are educators, followed by parents and finally persons committed to equity. Which doesn't mean ownership of assets with debts or liabilities, but equality of outcomes in the new language of intersectional social justice. But wait, there's more. The current featured topic in the series is being anti-racist, a celebration of race-based policies and outcomes as defined by social justice activist Ibram X. Kendi and others. Just wait till you get to social identities and systems of oppression. It's bad enough that this kind of racialist propaganda is being pushed by the taxpayer-funded Smithsonian, but it gets worse. The Trump administration is literally paying race hucksters to brainwash its own employees right now. Defense Secretary Mark Esper Virtue signaled on Twitter on Wednesday about the first meeting of the Department of Defense Board on Diversity and Inclusion, which will do such vitally important work as reviewing hairstyle and grooming policies for racial bias. Just last week, the US Army emailed out a graphic describing President Donald Trump's campaign slogan "Make America Great Again" as an example of covert white supremacy, only to say it was done in error when caught. Leaked documents published by researcher Christopher Rufo show diversity training along the lines above currently being carried out at the Treasury Department. The contractor who is doing this billed the federal government millions for various diversity schemes over the past 15 years. People like that are part of an entire cottage industry of anti-racism consultants that charge big money for educating captive audiences of corporate and government employees, forced to attend their sensitivity training and unconscious bias workshops for years. The best part for them, not for the country, is that the way they define racism. It can never be overcome or resolved, requiring their grift to continue indefinitely. By the logic of these anti-racist educators, when Martin Luther King Jr. dreamed a dream in 1963 that his children will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character, he was in fact racist. Segregation is not an evil to be condemned, but a good that brings about equity. Now bend the knee and fork over your money, sinners. This is racism masquerading as anti-racism, as Rufo puts it, calling for the Trump administration to immediately ban the teaching of toxic principles of critical race theory, race essentialism, and neo-segregationism. There is ample evidence these teachings underpinned last month's race riots across America. If left unchecked, it isn't too hard to see that there will be war.